Good evening. Today is Tuesday, August 27th, 2024, and the board meeting is now called to order at 6:05. All board members and student advisors are present, except for directors Guzman Ortiz and Hinojosa Pressy. At this time, Dr. Chandra Gray, will you read the land acknowledgement?
Thank you, Chair. We are gathered today on the land of the Kalapuya, who are represented by the Confederate Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederate Tribes of the Siletz Indians. The relationship between the Kalapuya people and this land continues unbroken to this day. And we offer gratitude for the land and for the generations present and past who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. We respectfully acknowledge and honor past, present, and future Native American and Indigenous students and staff of Salem-Keizer Public Schools. We invite you to join us in honoring these ancestral grounds and celebrating the resilience and strength of all Native American and Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you. Will you please join me in stating the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Superintendent Castaneda, are there any modifications to the agenda?
No, there are not.
At this time, we will go right into our work session. Now, Superintendent Castaneda and Chief Operations Officer Bob Silver will provide us with some background information regarding legislative agendas and provide us with an opportunity to engage in meaningful discussion on the topic.
Thank you, Chair. So this is an extension of a topic that we started at its most basic level at our board retreat when we talked about the importance of this year as one sitting on the verge of a new biennium and all of the opportunities that presents to Salem-Keizer Public Schools and specifically to the board in establishing a clear legislative agenda. As we think back on the year that we traveled through, it is, I think, easy for us to all remember how acutely state issues and specifically state funding issues affected our district. And you'll see large portions of this document before you reflecting some of the most important and obvious agenda items that will address state funding. It does include other items as well. So the way that we'll structure our discussion tonight is that Bob Silva and I will go back and forth in sharing the basics of each item of this proposed agenda. It's this agenda we built for you based on our research and also on the work that we've done with our partner organizations like COSA and OSBA. And we believe it represents a very solid initial basis for a proposed agenda for our district as adopted by the board. So with that, I actually believe that what we'll do is just introduce each item, provide a very quick overview. There's a lot of detail in this packet, and then pause for questions on each item before we move to the next one. And Chief Operating Officer Bob Silva is going to start with the first and in many ways the biggest item, which is current service level.
Oh, it's hot.
Now.
I apologize. Good evening, Board Chair Richardson, Superintendent Castaneda, members of the board. So the first item that we're discussing is and it's framed here as an accurate method for calculating the true cost of operating schools. So in the state of Oregon, the process for doing that is called the current service level, or CSL for short. And what that is basically the method that the state of Oregon uses through a variety of formulas and calculations to estimate the roll-up costs from year to year for both state government, but that also includes school districts. Up until recently, the formula used to calculate CSL for school districts has not been updated for nearly 30 years. So it's definitely been time, and the governor did put a task force together this year to look at that and has proposed some recommended changes that the legislature will need to consider in the next session when they come together next year. So the impact on Salem-Keizer has been, well, it's hard to estimate the impact, but the way that the CSL was calculated obviously has a pretty significant impact on us. And across the state, the recommended changes are worth about $515 million. And for Salem-Keizer, that would translate into approximately $36 million for us over the course of a biennium. So you can see our proposed policy statements. We want to recognize the governor's effort to address certain elements of the current service level formula and really encourage the legislature to provide the funding for those recommendations.
Before we turn it to you all for questions, I think I'll just add one clarifying detail to the bold language that says if funded at the estimated level of $515 million for the state. One of the things that I want to clarify here, there's two pieces. The first is that $515 million reflects the increase from the current method, not the total increase. But this increase from the current method is the most important way to represent this right now, because it shows the change that the governor's office and the work of the task force is recommending. These changes themselves don't require legislation, but the funding does require the support of the delegation. And then the second thing I want to clarify here is that this money, while deeply needed, and I do want to recognize a budget committee member who's here, Dr. Schwab. This will sound familiar to you. This money is greatly needed. This money basically keeps pace with the pace that our expenses increase. So while it looks like an increase on paper, and it in fact is, it's not easily or correctly understood as reinstatement or recovery money. This just helps us keep pace with real growth. And with that, I'll turn it over to you all for questions.
So thank you.
Director Harnish?
Thank you, Chair. So with this proposal that is being put forward by the governor, can you speak a little bit, maybe you did and I just didn't hear it, about what the changes would need? Are there further changes next biennium that we need to be made going forward?
Specifically to CSL?
Correct.
Well, the task force acted on the most important issues that school districts have been raising for, I believe it's safe to say, decades, but certainly for the last 10 to 15 years. The biggest issues that they acted upon were ones related to the method they used to calculate and project the rate of personnel cost increase, and then a technical but meaningful issue related to how they split the funding across the 2 years of the biennium. There are a few things that we're still eager and hopeful could be fixed, but they are smaller in dollar value and certainly shouldn't detract from our sense of gratitude and recognition for this as a very significant and long overdue adjustment. The governor said she was going to do it, and she did it, and it is widely considered to be a major step forward in policymaking and education funding in Oregon.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Superintendent. So I just want to clarify, this is like the current service level, so it's essentially continuing what we are doing. And this is adjusting for the inflationary changes and the cost of labor expense increase. It is not tied to any outcome, what we are hoping to achieve, or any outcome I can think of which our teachers have asked in terms of a class size ratio or addressing some of the very challenging, difficult situation. Because there is a piece that I'm not entirely clear. So we are essentially continuing the same service level, but our world has changed after the pandemic, after the school closure and school opening. And I mean, I really applaud Governor for doing this, don't get me wrong. But what I'm not entirely clear is, year to year inflationary rates are so hard to predict that if our labor expenses or the demand goes up, we'll soon get ready for another bargaining and labor negotiation. So that's one piece of the challenge. And if it is not tied to an outcome, like when the QM committee initially started, it was tied to a small class size of 21 children per class or 4-year graduation rate. Our goal was by third grade, they are able to read. So I'm not sure how we are going to achieve those goals if we are just continuing the same thing. So should we be asking a little bit more than that, is to do like a costing study for adequacy and equity or something like that? Because along with that, because there is a lot of support for this without our help. So
Yeah.
don't you think this would be a place to ask, saying, can we do if not this year, hopefully the legislature can order a proper costing. Nobody has done it, at least to the best of my ability to understand.
So there's two elements that I want to address. The first is just for your background reference. If we were to add the $515 million possible increase on top of the amount that it would have otherwise increased based on the old method, what we get is over $1 billion increase in education funding in Oregon. And while I don't think any of us who work for or in schools believe that that will cover all of our needs, it is such a step forward that I think people are really wanting to focus on securing political support for that. However, your points are very well taken, and if you turn to page 5 and you look at number 4 on page 5, I hope what you'll see is our agreement with your thoughts, Dr. Chandragiri, about keeping a focus on securing advocacy and support for the, in effect, 1.1 billion, but not taking our eyes off the prize of the long-term goal of a review of QEM, of adequacy, a resetting of the standards inside of QEM, and how it eventually impacts public education in Oregon.
Thank you. I know there's another piece that is attached to this. Can we continue whatever program that we have now using this dollar? Just a question I had.
Are you saying if we were to receive the additional funding, can we continue the programming we have?
Yeah, thank you.
It's a little early for us to predict that, absolutely, but this funding, if it came through, would certainly close what remains of our gap
Okay,
and allow us to anticipate reasonable growth for the future.
thank you.
What it does not allow us to do is reinstate the 70 million in reductions and adjustments we made last year.
Thank you.
I just wanted to quickly weigh in that I think this is historic. I'm so grateful to Governor Kotek for taking this on. And I believe our chair helped participate in that work group. So want to publicly thank her for her advocacy it's clear that this has been needed for a long time. It's not a done deal. Like, as we know, this is the governor's recommendation, and now it will be up to the legislature to actually make it happen. And so I think my question centers around the proposed process for the board. Would we adopt these policy statements and then be working towards sort of a legislative advocacy plan for board members? Because it's really going to take bipartisan support to get just this across the finish line, and this doesn't solve all of our problems.
That is pretty much exactly what we're hoping to support you in doing. The first step being bringing the research and our best thinking to bear. The conversation we have tonight will help us know what sorts of refinements would be required to improve this. And then in the September meeting, bring it back to you. You wouldn't be adopting a document of this level of detail, but rather the one-page summary that captures the board sentiments. With that, it allows all of us to go out into the world and know for sure that we are accurately reflecting the will of this board in advocating with legislators in groups or individually. And we'd be connected to the hope that board members would pursue that kind of advocacy individually.
Sati.
Yeah. I mean, we do have two big organizations who do the, advocacy from a legislative political point of view, OSBA and COSA, I believe, right? So this does align with one of the legislative priority of OSBA. I just wanted to know, promote adequate, predictable, stable funding alignment. So is there a possibility that if we support it, then we can say that we will work with OSBA? And I don't know about COSA's legislative priority. I haven't seen their document. That we can kind of make sure that, because I was just thinking in my head, how can we have one layer of separation from being directly politically involved versus using our OSBA and COSA as a channel, and so that we are all aligned in this effort rather than each of us trying to do. We will go talk to the legislature, but to get us to align with OSBA would be one thought I'm having. Anyway, we are paying dues and they are supposed to help us in this. Would that be okay?
If I understand your question, it's how do we partner so that our district's work, your work as a board, is amplifying and complementary to OSBA's work. So yes, I think that's actually what we're shooting for here. It is working earlier than we normally do as a K-12 system in Oregon to establish clear legislative agendas that are shared across as many districts as possible and complement and coincide with those held by our core partners like COSA and OSBA. I also feel hopeful that there'll be a lot of similarity between what comes out of this process and what we see with our labor partners, because there is a lot of shared interest in the items on these pages. And I believe that we will find that there is great agreement on the core topics in this page and what will come in final packages from OSBA and COSA.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions or discussion? Okay, if not, we move to the next topic.
We covered a lot of process issues, so some of these others might start to feel like it's just about content. So item 2 actually has 3 parts. All of them relate to special education funding and our ability to provide great educational services, especially to our students with disabilities. The first one, topic 2A, it addresses the also decades-old special education funding cap in the state funding formula. The current cap is 11%, and it means that for no more than 11% of your enrollment can you get the double weight that the funding formula provides, unless you have a state waiver. like nearly every district in the state, in that our percentages is far over 11. And this is a place where there is a lot of energy and advocacy because of the gap in spending between what districts spend on special education service and what the state helps us pay for. A couple of key things to note on this one. The first, you're going to hear us say this over and over, there must be new funding to support this. It would actually be worse to have them increase the cap but redistribute the existing funding than it would be to not touch the capital. The other thing that I want to say about this is that you'll see here that the state and national average is right around 15%. Salem-Keizer's at 17.9%. What this means for sure is that we are over-identifying students with disabilities. There are other contributing factors, but I don't think that we should mince words about that fact. It would not be our team's recommendation to you that this approach creates financial incentives for districts to identify students inaccurately. It is our recommendation that the cap be increased to about the national and state average and also have automatic escalators. We don't want to be enriched by a practice that we want to be phasing out. We do want to have a funding formula that recognizes our true costs and helps us meet them. So I will pause there for any questions.
I just want to say out of 197 school districts, there are only 30 that currently meet the percentage below what the cap is. Ashley?
Thank you for this one. I think this one really is so important for us to address. I am a little concerned with the terminology over-identifying kids with disabilities. What exactly do you mean by that?
It's actually something that ends up being statistically common in places with large numbers of English language learners. And what it can often happen is that the learning needs of students as they are acquiring a second language gets mixed up with a special education identification process. And this is how you end up in situations that, for example, we could have an over-identification of English language learners as eligible for special education services. It also often happens in school districts that have higher rates of poverty, so urban school districts, because of the diversity, the cultural, language, and racial diversity of their students gets commingled into a process that misunderstands aspects of their behavior as being related to disability when it might actually be any number of other differences, but not a true disability. And so we are no way alone in being a district that is over-identified against a national average, but it is something that we need to work on. And I'll actually pause here because I think Olga is a great person to add additional thoughts to this portion of the conversation if there's anything you wish to add.
No.
Leave it alone.
Oh, there we go. It was live. Thank you. Just wanted to add that this is an area that we have been paying close attention to because, like Superintendent Castañeda shared, sometimes the trajectory and development of that second language gets confused as a delay in learning. And students are not producing enough output of language to explain what they understand in a first language or the concepts that they already understand at home and that they can explain in that first home language. And so to provide supports, then sometimes they are accessing special education services that they don't need. We just need to give them time to develop that second language that takes 3 to 7 years. So I think it's important to underscore we are over that 11% threshold, but we are also paying a lot of attention to how we pay attention to how we serve students in those processes of eligibility.
Okay, thank you. I think the language choice bothers me a little bit because I feel like, thank you for that explanation. I didn't know that. It's like misidentification of a disability that is not a disability because we're not identifying other true needs. But if there are many kids that have disabilities in our district, I don't want them to get missed, or for us to be saying that we're over-identifying. It struck me because I'm such an advocate for people with disabilities that I want to make sure. I feel like we have a very strong special education department and program, and that we're really attuned to what kids need with disabilities, and just don't want to lose that focus in the district.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I think that what we do is, instead of not looking into something and assuming is language, we add steps to make sure that we can assess for language, that we can really understand and do some. That's why we have some psychologists that are bilingual, bicultural, and so we use our translations department to meet with the family and make sure that we're looking at every single area of development for that student before we continue with the process. So we're adding steps instead of not having enough. That will also get us to the concern that you have.
Director Carson Cottingham will also just say that's an excellent point relative to a legislative agenda, because within the K-12 world, we're very used to talking about over-identification, and so it sounds normal to us. But in the kind of broader public, the choice of words really matters, because it's clearly startling, and that's where we want the words to be exactly right.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. In preparation for today, I just got this, I was kind of reading, and the Legislative Revenue Office had chosen that same language which you used. They used 4 principles in the beginning. Avoid incentive for school district to increase their allocation. Method, minimize number of classification and set limits. So they unfortunately have used a similar language. So I appreciate you bringing it up. I have a slightly different question, because this special education, this weightage came out of a 1988 study, national study, that 2 weightage is enough. Has anybody studied after that saying 2 is enough, or you need more than 2? That's one part of the question. And let's say the child with special education, all the testing has shown, they also struggle with, say, they speak another language at home, say Spanish at home, or they have other potential areas of weightage. How many such weightage can we add on top of the base money?
To the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been a study of whether or not the 2.0 is enough based on more recent trends in the presentation of disabilities or in rates of growth within certain categories. I think that topic too falls generally into the topic you raised before, which is really about a study commission on the adequacy of the funding model. And this proposal, as you see it in these first pages, really relies on the concept that we do this in a series of bold increments. And the first is getting CSL and special education more properly funded. The second is studying the function of the formula in general. And the answer to your question around the weights, the most that we can get is a weighting of 2.0.
So maximum 2 of those weightages for cost factor we can
Yes.
calculate.
And the 2.0 cap is one that's debated widely. In a place like Salem-Keizer, where we have a lot of intersectionality, 2.0 really doesn't adequately cover the complexity of need that might be present for a student who is learning a second language and is pregnant and parenting and is a qualifying student with a disability. So there are a lot of features inside the funding formula itself that deserve future study, but 1.1 billion in CSL plus a possible chunk of special education is such a huge step forward for one biennium that our recommendation to you all is to break these into separate bold steps and not include a reconsideration of weighting in the current legislative agenda.
Just a follow-up, these children also have, let's say they have Oregon Health Authority, they have federal funding because of their disability. Could we at least attempt to ask the ability to braid some funds so that, because each of the children, the dollar should ideally follow the children. So is there a way to ask that as an option in addition to what we are asking, raising the cap? Because we are still trying to approach it in silos. This is what we do versus, these are system issues. These children have to go home and they have to also get other healthcare needs. So what do you think of just adding that piece of braiding the funds and ability to use it?
Well, you've once again anticipated elements of this package, and so if you could hold that question until
Okay.
we get to item 3,
Okay.
we'll talk about that really important issue in a little more detail. Okay.
Sorry, I don't know how close I need to be for this. I really agree with what Director Carson Cunningham said about like the phrasing of over identifying students with a disability. Is our process for like identifying ESL learners or like their needs and identifying a student with a disability, is it like a similar process? Is that kind of what?
The initial process is not similar. They use very different initial measurements and have very different tools. And I'll invite Olga in a moment, but the moment that the two combine are when, if we're talking specifically about English language learners, the moment they combine is when a school system becomes concerned about possible delays and isn't fully taking into account the naturally occurring delay of onboarding 2 languages and new content at the same time. And so what can present to some people as a delay is actually just the tremendous cognitive work of learning whole new topics in 2 languages. And so though the process is different, they do touch each other in the middle and especially in the early years. What would you add, Olga?
I think the only thing I would add is that the process also is not a one and done assessment. It's an assessment that helps the specialist supporting that student continue to go deeper into the root cause of what's having that student be behind. And so you do a first assessment and then you intervene with a lot of instruction. Then you do if the student is not making progress, then you do another assessment, and if that student is an EL, you're doing assessments that take in consideration the languages spoken at home, and then you intervene to get deeper into what is it exactly that's happening. So because that process is so detailed, we are doing a better and better job at making sure that once we see if it's a language situation, then the student with the language support starts making progress right away. And then we know, okay, it wasn't a special education need. But if the student continues to stay behind, even though we have provided language supports at home or supports for the parents and supports at school in that language, then we know something more is happening. Maybe it's a processing issue, maybe it's memory, and then more specialists are invited to the table until we get to the real situation. So it's a process that it's complex and it has many, many steps so that we don't miss out on diagnosing exactly what's happening with the student.
And then have you seen that this process is similar to ones that they use in other school districts, or is it like a process that we have specifically, I'm sorry, is it like a process that we as Salem-Keizer kind of created, or is it one that is kind of like just Oregon or statewide?
I think we are, because of our interest and our knowledge in language, I would say we are doing a good job on continuing to develop our skills around language. But this is something that we come together with other districts to have conversations about and to learn from. We know that there are other districts like Hillsborough that has great processes in place, and so we're always learning from each other, but we also feel like we're headed in the right direction.
This issue is an important one, and although the rates at which we identify students for disabilities is not the centerpiece of this as a legislative agenda, I'm really glad we're spending the time on it because it is a principled position that we bring to you around the recommendation of the formula. Even if it could be the case that the cap would be removed entirely, and even if it were the case that we would financially benefit, we still don't believe that is the right policy position for a school district to take. Okay, any other questions on this one before we move on to our next special education?
Sorry, one clarifying question. The last thing you said, what is not the right policy?
We wouldn't bring to you the recommendation that the board, as a matter of a policy agenda, say remove the cap altogether.
Entirely,
Yeah.
okay. But you are saying the current cap is not adequate and something needs to happen.
Yes, our recommendation is to match the national average and add an automatic escalator to keep pace with changes in rates.
Okay, so our advocacy position would be around 15%. Okay. I'll just flag that I might not agree with that. Because I would rather we advocate for what we currently have, and with the knowledge that there could be some under-identification for certain groups of students. I don't know that to be true. I know I was reading a medical journal last night about like extreme underdiagnosis for women and girls with learning disabilities, like all throughout K through 12. So I don't know how that plays out in our district or if it does, but just flagging that.
So I just have a follow-up to what you brought up, Ashley. Sometimes our parents try to get the testing done. There's a waiting period when the testing can be completed because of the resource issue. And the child is still struggling. And they come, then they kind of try to see what can be done, because until then, it doesn't reach the threshold to get the services. And then finally, they have insurance because both husband and wife are working, and they're working in the district, and they have insurance to go out and get from a psychologist. Now the child is diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And now they come back with that testing, and now the child is enrolled in the special services, IEP, etc. So I'm really kind of asking, it's a good question you asked, because until the testing is done, you don't get into the program. But we do have, 504 and ADA and individualized education. There are so many legal protections for these children. So so if there is a delay, is there a way for the child to go out and get some testing done and come back? And then, because the longer they wait, there's the collateral problems that they are having, right? They're not getting the right kind of level of care. So when we are asking for this cap, will this cap solve the problem, or is there some other way to ask another piece along with this advocacy, saying if they go out and get it done and they didn't, is there a way to reimburse the school district for that? I don't know if I'm making sense.
I don't think it would be part of your policy agenda. This
Okay.
is so heavily regulated federally that a lot of the things that might seem like they're a clear step forward from a state perspective will immediately be stymied in longstanding federal law. Right now, it is possible for families to get an independent diagnosis and use that as part of the process that a school district operates. But you have now, for the third time tonight, predicted another item on our agenda. And so maybe if we can hold that one until we talk about early identification and early intervention services. I think that's actually the most important place that from a policy perspective, this state can do important work on behalf of wait lists and giving kids the kind of start that they deserve.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, item 2B. Early intervening, or I'm sorry, 2B, which is the high-cost disability reimbursement program. So for a while, there's been a method inside of the state education funding that recognizes that there are certain disability categories and also scenarios in which the cost of providing education services is significantly greater than the 2.0. But as you can see from the background portion here, that has not kept pace with the real changes in identification and in cost. So you can see that from 2003 forward, the amount available for reimbursement to school districts for qualifying students has continued to drop. And so you'll see here, as a clarifier, this is 49 cents, not a half a cent. But you can see that it dropped from 78 cents on an eligible dollar to 49, and is anticipated without intervention to continue to decline. That's because there are more services, more students who are eligible for this program in Oregon every single year, and the dollars that are appropriated are not keeping up. And so here you'll see just our share of an increase to full reimbursement would be $5 million over the biennium. This is, I think, what many superintendents would describe as a common sense adjustment. And here, this is a place where our size buffers us, but for small school districts, especially very small school districts, it really only 1 or 2 students that come in at, $70,000 can really throw an entire budget into a bit of hardship. And so this is one that I will say is very important to districts across Oregon, including to a certain degree us. And I'll pause there for questions.
I just wondered, is this Medicaid matching? Is this a matching grant for the kiddos with high-cost disability? This is only state
It's
funds?
only state funds.
Okay, and are the kiddos that are generally in this category also supported then through Medicaid?
Yes.
I don't know the answer to how the internal billing and reimbursement structure works inside of the service providers.
Okay, thank you.
I know that these are our real costs.
Chair, can I ask a question? Sure. Thank you, Chair. So if we get this high-cost disability dollar, does that proportionately reduce our district formula revenue for our district?
You'll see a repetitive statement at the end of all of the proposed policy statements that says redistribution of existing funding would create winners and losers in that cause collective harm. It is true for every single element of the special education items. It right now is a carve-out of the state school fund. If they don't appropriate additional money, all it does is back out a little bit more for every district, and then increase the funding for everyone who's eligible. In so doing, it doesn't actually improve our collective situation.
I really brought that up because I can try to read the one for the legislative, whatever they make the summary, where it clearly has a thing that if you get the $30,000 or whatever it is, they will deduct it from because their formula is district formula equals this plus high cost disability grant. So as of now, that is the way it is worded. I guess that's the way they practice. It's not very clear from this policy statement. That's what your intention was. At least I couldn't understand it. So we'll have to spell it out clearly, saying this should not lead to
Reduce local funding.
reducing our district formula grant, because otherwise it can wipe out our budget completely. Just few kids, they will give us what they want. Our district formula revenue will go down significantly.
I think we can clarify that
Okay.
easily.
And that's how I understood. Maybe others had a different take on that statement in the last one. My worry is like 3 kids with 50,000 or 60,000. That would mean anything more than 30,000 or whatever it is, they shouldn't deduct from there.
It is not my understanding that there's a dollar for dollar reduction at a district level. But if you imagine it as a pie, and the disability reimbursement program is just one piece that grows, what it does is slightly diminish the redistribution of the funding for everyone else. So it is not a dollar for dollar adjustment, but it is still a hardship, and I think your proposed edit is one that we can work into this.
Yeah, and they just appropriate X amount of dollars for the whole state. Is that
In the
how
state
it
school
is?
fund?
No, this high cost disability grant. For the entire state, we are working out of that pie, that kind of pot of money.
That's why the reimbursement rate keeps falling every year, because more and more kids become eligible, but the appropriation doesn't increase at
Correct.
the same rate. You go from a 78-cent per dollar eligible dollar reimbursement down to less than 49.
So could we kind of word it like saying proportionate to the high cost disability identified children, there has to be proportionate appropriation of money to make sure that is met?
Yeah, we can work on that wording.
Because otherwise, they may add a few $1 million, but still it'll come out of the same pot of gold. Sorry.
Yep. All right, I will move on to item 2C. We are getting to the first of Director Chandra Gary's predictions, and also one that there's some pre-existing expertise on at the table. So 2C is about early childhood screening and intervention services, and about the services provided through regionalized service providers for low incidence disabilities. And this is a complicated topic. I might have to lean on a combination of Olga and Bob to unpack, but at its most essential level, what Oregon has done is created a series of provider networks, mostly the regional ESDs. And so ours is the WESD, and made them responsible for the majority of screening and early intervention before students enter our system. Unfortunately, along the way, the funding model stopped keeping pace with the rate that ESDs are actually serving. So caseload numbers went up much faster, especially after the pandemic, than state funding went up. The net effect of that is that we and many other school districts have a number of students and families who are caught in the bottleneck of ESDs. They're not being screened as quickly as the ESDs want to, and they are definitely not getting the early intervention services that they have a right to, because the ESDs are not funded or staffed to keep up with the volume they face. The net effect on this for our students and families is that they're entering with a less strong start than they should otherwise have had. The ESDs need to be funded to keep pace with their responsibilities. And this is coupled with a diminished and now inadequate funding stream for low incidence disabilities. You guys might remember receiving a number of emails last year about the deaf and hard of hearing program. This is the issue that caused that. Inadequate funding of low incidence disabilities results in the inability of the ESDs to be able to maintain viable programs. So this is a combined approach that says we need our partners to be able to do their job for kids and families so that we can do our job for kids and families. And I want to pause here and turn this over especially to Olga, who's been working on this for a long time, to add additional comments and clarification or corrections.
I think the only thing that I would add is that it's also important to remember that we have pre-Ks in different sites. And so Willamette ESD service providers need to be available for kids that are not only served in pre-Ks, but also in home care environments, all coming to our district, and there's just not enough of them. And at the end, like Superintendent Castañeda said, our students come in without the supports and the resources. Even if they have been identified for a year, sometimes they have been in a wait list that takes a year to get one assessment. So it's an area of high need for us, and that we need some important attention from legislatures.
This, Dr. Chandragiri, is the place where if the board has an instinct to focus on increasing the pace of services, this is the highest impact, I believe, the highest impact place for our school system and community.
I just have a question, Chair.
Yes.
Thank you. So this is, we are talking about pre-K to third grade, right? This, or even before they come to kindergarten. Before they come to kindergarten, from birth to 0 to 5. So, you know, there are so many different agencies get the money and they are involved, like Oregon Health Authority and etc. They are all asking to work on similar metrics. So, and we are waiting, is this a federal who is deciding that only ESD has to screen? Why can't we get that information from other sources where they have been tested and screened and things like that? Because I would assume that screening can be done in a pediatrics office or when the child is born. And so can we not have a system, can a legislative concept not be that the data from various sources from antenatal period all the way to age 5 can be used? Or is there a systemic barrier at a federal level? I'm not entirely clear why we are stuck with this model and then we are struggling. My goal is to get the kids screened as quickly as possible. And so that hearing, vision, all this. Problem with that is if you delay, you're going to permanently lose the vision. And you know, the newborn cataract is the story, right? So if somebody can help me understand, where did this come about, the history behind why we are stuck in this? Because even this is not going to solve the problem. This is only going to make us do our inefficient systems in an efficient way rather than solve the underlying problems of system barrier. I don't know if I'm making sense. Like adding more money will probably increase more staffing at ESD, but still we are going to never be able to catch up with all the newborn babies showing up to our school system and screen thing. So can another, like OHA or somebody else, partner with ODE and early learning department that they have created to at least help get the data which will allow us to bring these kids sooner, catch them sooner?
I can try with a bit of the answer. I think there is a lot of collaboration between the ESD and clinicians, medical providers, other organizations. I just also think it's a matter of capacity. They don't have enough people to respond to the needs. And then we're trying to think outside the box for 2 years. and said, what if we create some a bridge in help with that, but at the same time, we are an organization that is pre-K to 12 or K to 12, and so I think it will take a lot of, we also started thinking of collaboration with Willamette ESD, the Hub, DHS. We have been thinking about these differently, but we rely on the expertise that the Willamette ESD brings to us on that 0 to 5 age group that we are not, we're not experienced in serving. So I guess it's a non-answer, but just adding to, we have been thinking about it and trying to figure out a solution, but I also think it's a matter of capacity and lack of funding to bring more of the people that know how to do this work 0 to 5 really well.
Thank you. We have two questions. Director Harnish and then Director Guzman Ortiz has joined us, and she has a question as well.
Great. Thank you very much. And this is an area I get very passionate about. I am in no means an expert, but this is sort of where I spend a lot of my professional work. And so I get very excited about the ability for us to advocate legislatively for a system that has been grossly underfunded for years, even more so in the last biennium. And I know that we have seen such an uptick in the number of children who are being assessed or referred to Willamette ESD for an assessment, which is they're the only entity that actually can, to your question, make the designation of early intervention or early childhood special education for an IFSP or an IEP. They're the only ones that are able to do that. I think what's also, I think, just notable about our district in terms of how we do partner together to, because you can imagine with the children being referred, it's actually only a small percentage actually that will qualify for the service, which is very frustrating for all the professionals. But there's a particular lane in which they have to be able to qualify somebody eligible for those services. So not only do you have a lot of children going and families going through, but only a certain number get the level of support. And I think what you're talking to is a very important piece of the work that we have to do as a district and as a community to help to support families that are waiting to be seen and assessed and hopefully diagnosed, and then for those that aren't. And it's gonna have to be a collective piece. And so there is the metric, the social emotional metric that I think will also is having an impact on that. So there's a lot of different ways, which is what we're not here to necessarily talk about, but I would say that this is part and parcel of that work. So I'm very excited to see this one on there.
Thank you. Director Guzman Ortiz.
Good evening, everyone. I wanted to just check on, and it doesn't have to be provided today, but it would be helpful if we have, I guess, numbers just for us to understand, or for myself, I'll speak for myself, to understand kind of the level of identification, or the number of identification, level of identification in the K-3 spectrum, right? I think it's helpful when thinking about what we're advocating, right, to just have a sense of the need. And so I do see the number here on the draft form around the state study that was commissioned, around like $50 million like underfunding over the biennium. But it just, if we have numbers in terms of how many kiddos are being identified, and I know we've talked about this a little bit. Again, don't need a response right now, but I think it would be really helpful to get a sense of, in practical terms, what does that need within our district? And thanks, Director Harnish, I think you just laid out really, really neatly, there are layers of need within this, and so our district impact is one of them for now.
I just have a follow-up.
Okay.
Maybe I'm not entirely clear why where is the barrier? Why only ESD is mandated to do? Is that a federal barrier? Is it a state barrier? Or can the legislative concept be to give us a variance so that we can have different, because same thing is being measured in different places, but the barrier is coming from only ESD.
It's not an ESD issue, nor is it even an Oregon issue. I can speak to this just a little across various states and the way that it has interplay with federal requirements. I think that for better or for worse, the desire to provide services to students has been understood to flow most efficiently through their entry into education. And at first that was K-12. But then with early intervention and early screening, it later became funneled through early childhood providers that receive state or federal money, and they became responsible for the first point of contact with families. And it is largely because that's the place where we are most likely to see the largest number of youngsters first. While there are pediatric visits and there are other things, they are very dispersed. They're atomized across providers and across families, across state lines, across even nations. But the thing that does happen is they start showing up for education, whether it's early childhood education or K-12. And so the screening, the identification, and the services got linked to the first point where there are taxpayer dollars and therefore regulations attached to the provider. And this is where the ESD comes in, because the ESD is themselves not the only place that families go. They get referred there from licensed early childhood centers. And it's not because the student shows up necessarily in need of services, it's because one of the first things they are required to do under regulation and law is ensure that an early childhood screening happens. And so what you're seeing is the effect of the pre-K providers routing them to the ESD getting swamped by a caseload that's far greater than they're funded for. And then the delay between that point and their entry into the public education system.
So, what Lisa, you mentioned that from the time they are in the waiting list, who is holding these kids and helping them before they enter kindergarten? Like is there like a Montessori, is there a pre-kindergarten program that we do offer, right? So they may be in the waiting list for being screened and tested by the ESD. So school is literally taking care of them.
Well, it could be early childhood providers, it could be early Head Start, it could be licensed providers.
So here is where an equity issue. The reason I'm bringing it up is a lot of our children say they have multilingual potential. Like a third of American kids are, their potential multilingual potential. They speak different languages at home and Spanish and others. So is there any way to ask for some funding to develop some kind of dual language, from age 3 to age, by the time they come to our kindergarten? So there is something going on in terms of intervention, because by the time if they go through an early program and they come to our kindergarten, it can really help close the gap for reading and math, etc. And so while they're waiting for ESD screening, is there something we can say that give us enough funding? Because not many people children of color and immigrant community are aware of this, are utilizing to the extent that we want, and the programs are not like a dual language capable for little kids. So is there some way we can tie this with an equity and say we need additional funding? I'm just thinking aloud, considering the volume of children we have with the scale of the problem, sorry.
It would not be my recommendation. This is a decision of the board. This would be your policy agenda. That would not be my recommendation, because the complexity of us trying to reach into an entire developmental period and dispersed community system would be an enormous reach for us when there are already pre-existing vehicles that can do it faster and better than we can. The problem is that the pre-existing vehicles aren't funded adequately. It would be a displacement of resources, and I think we would struggle to do it timely and well.
It's a very narrow focus in this. I was kind of thinking of what do we do with those children while they are waiting for testing? Soon they'll be reaching our first grade if they're waiting long enough, right, without being tested.
This is why it's so urgent that we get early intervention going for pre-K, so that when they enter our system at the earliest point, they've already been accurately diagnosed and they are receiving the services they need for a strong start.
Okay, next item.
The good news is we are now through the most complex items for sure. And for this third one, Director Chandragiri also noticed a version of this earlier. We'll ask Bob Silva to present on this one.
All right. So item number 3 is to exercise caution in creating new restricted grant programs. I think we're all aware that there's more needs identified than there is funding available. So a lot of times we create and fund these specialized programs or restricted grants to address the issues. And what's not adequately accounted for is the sum of all of those grants have started to create an administrative burden on the school district that's not really sustainable for us. So as an example, we have a 3-person team that manages about $140 million of state and federal grants. And it's extremely challenging given the reporting requirements that grants have. And as we continue to, again, try to address some of these unique circumstances and provide services to students that really need it, there needs to be consideration of the impact or how to help school districts sustain and support the additional programs. So our recommendation for language is to prioritize adequate and stable funding for the state school fund and other core investments, and to oppose the creation of additional categorical funding that is not sustainable or that puts school districts in competition with each other through competitive grants.
To this, I will only add that this gets directly to your point about fund braiding. The more tiny streams, or if we want to use the metaphor consistently, strands of funding that cannot be braided together, the more difficult it is to run an efficient and coherent model. And this one, we really worked hard on this one because it's hard to say no to money. It really is. I will use the summer school money as an example. We received a summer school grant. We were happy for it. We put it to work through community-based providers. But it is an odd situation when we receive new money for summer school at the same time that we face a $70 million structural gap, and we can't even pay for our own staff. The more that the system continues to add boutique categoricals, while at the same time underfunding the core, the more we become spread out, siloed in our functioning, and struggle to just do what we are required to do in general. And this is going to be a really important line to manage, because we're not saying we're not grateful for funding, but we're saying what's most urgent is funding the core. And if there is money to put at something, please put it in the state school fund. Not small pilots, especially small pilots that require school districts to compete against each other for very burdensome funding that is critical to the work we do, but almost difficult, almost impossible to sustain.
Yes, Lisa?
I would also maybe consider either scale or sustain, because often to that, I love the boutique categorical, I'm going to steal that. But often when pilots happen or small little programs, you can't scale them up in addition to sustain. So I would just, maybe there's something that could be woven in there.
Yes, Dr. Stockton?
Yeah. I mean, I suspect the grant should be used for like a testing of concept and see if it works and then kind of scale it up. If you have to kind of keep on depending on grant and it doesn't get budgeted, I'm a little concerned about that kind of model, because that's like taking a payday loan and going on a Disney cruise and saying, what do we do when you come back? So having said that, you know, in this, it would also be helpful when we talk to the legislator, are there similar unfunded mandate that literally kind of cancel each other or contradict each other or take us nowhere in terms of the direction? Is there policy alignment? So we could take some of these concrete examples when we discuss with them and say, you know, there are like 5 different reporting requirements for teen suicide, for example. And finally, they came up with the coroner's office can report. So I guess that would be the logical way. Because then that gets picked up, every suicide gets picked up and accurately reported. But we ended up creating 5 different departments, and somebody is keeping track of it. So I think some concrete examples would be helpful, how we can kind of start asking for alignment and perhaps repeal some of these requirements. I would go to that extent of saying, because we are just adding more and more and nobody knows which direction to push the car. It'll probably save us a lot of administrative burden, resources. When we don't have any, we can be laser focused on what we can do, and we all can push the car in the same direction. That's my thought in this.
Thank
Can be a
you.
little bit more fiscally conservative that way and use the dollars for really adding value to our children and staff. That's what.
To
Thank
give
you.
you an order of magnitude, that 38 million in restricted categorical funds, $750 million
Yep.
in the biennium. And that money is doing good work. I'm not saying it's not doing good work. But $750 million in restricted funds when a place like Salem-Keizer is gasping for air for the Corps, that's the issue that we want to artfully elevate without appearing to be ungrateful to the generous efforts of the legislature.
The smaller districts in Eastern Oregon sometimes don't have the structure to even apply and report, so they just say we don't need it. So that's the kind of dilemma if you're going to apply for, advocate for a state level. Smaller districts find that they just don't even apply for some of these grants.
Okay, item number 4.
Hey, I'm going to steal this one from you as well. I worked hard on this one. So item 4 is to correct past and suspend future unfunded or underfunded mandates. Quite often legislation is passed without adequate funding and sometimes without any funding at all. And I'll specifically call out, I want to do this carefully because it's hard work, I understand that, but the process to determine fiscal impacts, I think we need to work with our legislature to expand stakeholder input into that process to really identify some of those costs ahead of time, so at least they can be considered during the legislative session. We've listed 3 examples here, and I'll go over a few of them. So House Bill 2531 that was passed in 2023. We're trying to get rid of compact fluorescent light bulbs. They contain mercury and undesirable levels, not good for the environment, not good from an energy savings perspective. The cost to Salem-Keizer for that will be approximately $40 million to replace light fixtures to achieve the energy savings as a result, which is the intent of the legislation. So, that wasn't the intent of passing that law by the legislature, but the fiscal impact did not even discuss school districts or other government entities or any entity, because it's in the state of Oregon where you will no longer be able to purchase those light bulbs. So items like that. Another one was the Unemployment Act. Great for our staff, great for those staff that will be able to collect unemployment during the summer. The impact to the school district was calculable. Did I say that right? But they did not perform that calculation. And for Salem-Keizer, that can have up to a $10 million impact on us, given our current staffing levels. So again, it's just expanding the process that the legislature goes through to collect additional stakeholder input and really try to identify some of those costs that aren't as apparent on the surface of the legislation. So, and then the final example there was Senate Bill 819, important special ed legislation that went through last session as well. And goes back to the previous conversation, just the administrative overhead of managing all of that wasn't necessarily accounted for in the process. It was defined as being indeterminate in the fiscal impact statement. So we have 3 draft policy proposal statements for you. So the first is that the board opposes state mandates that do not specifically provide the resources, including funding and availability of time, both instructional and administrative, required to implement the mandate. Second one is the board supports additional funding to cover the costs associated with the new unemployment insurance provisions into law, enacted into law in House Bill 2531. And then finally, the board calls upon elected officials to carefully review fiscal impact statements for all new legislation and to call local school districts to collect more information about the direct and indirect costs of those new requirements. And I want to offer up a correction here. In the second statement, that should say Senate Bill 489, not House Bill 2531. Sorry about that. So the board supports additional funding to cover the costs associated with the new unemployment insurance provision enacted into law in Senate Bill 489, 2023.
Thank you, Bob. This one is, I think, quite self-explanatory. The recommendations are about both policy statements and also a request for action. It is not that any of these were inherently bad pieces of legislation, were improperly intended, or ill-considered. But when the cost is just not calculated, it doesn't make the cost go away. And on 489, I will say this is an issue that is extremely urgent for superintendents across the state. Nobody was prepared for expenses at the level that we are seeing. And I believe you will see this come up again and again over the course of the long session. So that concludes the big items that we present to you for consideration. We do not need to go through the items on page 6 with such meticulous detail because they are framed more as general support and general opposition. But I do want to just pause and leave time and space for any questions, thoughts, or concerns about these 7 items.
What's the next step you would propose that we approach this is my question to you, Chair. How do we want to take it and what can we do?
I think we've been presented with some very, very good information, some very, very good examples. I believe that we should totally support what we have in front of us. And the next steps are?
Well, our next step is we have detailed notes. This is a background document, like a briefing document, so that you feel informed about the issues. What we would be bringing to you for consideration and action in September is a one-page front and back. And instead of having all of this detail, what it has is a brief explanation and then the policy recommendation of the board, the sum total of which become your policy agenda. The second page of it are these statements. It's designed to be more accessible, easy to carry around, but be supplemented by the conversation that you had here today.
Do you anticipate this like an action item in voting or directing the board to talk to the OSBA or COSA? How do you propose that we take it to the next level?
At a September action item with a vote. It is my recommendation that something at this level reflects the board's position philosophically, and it's important that it be shared across the board. Sorry, that was unintended pun. Shared across this board uniformly.
Because we do have, I think, we have two LPC and one OSBA member, right? We do have, I think Maria is still the LPC, no?
Maybe.
So we do have a legislative and policy committee member, and so is this something that member will take it to the OSBA, or I'm also in the color
Excuse me.
process, so I can kind of share it with them.
Yeah.
Director Chandragiri, could you use your microphone, please?
Oh, sorry. So I was kind of wondering if is this like the board directing Director Hinios Presi to take it to the LPC, or is it for us to say it's okay for us to directly go talk to people? How, I don't know the process. That's some clarification will help us.
I might, in a second, ask Rebecca to clarify as she's seen versions of this with other boards, but here, my recommendation would be that the board adopts a shared policy agenda, and in so doing, with the authorizing vote, in effect says, this is something that can now be shared on behalf of the board to OSBA. It can be shared with COSA, it can be shared with our two labor partners, and it can be the basis of what you all individually and collectively share when you have the opportunity to speak with elected officials.
Thank you.
I have a question on bullet 6. The board offers full support for an increase in summer school programming funding. Are we going to mention anything about receiving that information about summer program funding earlier? We get it rather late and then try to act on it. Should we mention something there?
I think that is an important and easy addition to this.
Thank you.
Chair,
Yes.
in addition to the good point that you brought about the summer program, there was one year when they first rolled out, they were required to get 6 different types of insurances. Lot of small little CBOs couldn't get it in this country anyway. And I kind of kept calling everybody, including, so that became a barrier for almost like 300 and odd. I don't remember the exact number of small CBOs who became ineligible for that summer grant. So we kind of contacted the press, OPB covered it, and I think somebody else covered that. So what I'm saying is, from an equity lens, it'll be important that even small little CBOs or nonprofits should be able to compete.
Mm-hmm.
And it should be a very transparent process of applying for it, and there should be very little systemic barriers, because a lot of communities want to do something to make sure their children can have a year-round school program.
We can make that addition around systemic barriers as
Yeah.
well.
I I want to thank COO Bob Silva and our superintendent, Andrea Castaneda, for this very, very detailed information and report. I'm looking forward to September when we bring it back. And I know that I will be voting for this to be the documentation that we use for our legislative support. I want to thank you very much. And it is currently 7:29, and this meeting is adjourned.